The busy downtown streets of Los Angeles buzzed with the sounds of rushing footsteps, honking horns, and the hum of city life. People weaved in and out of crowds, their faces focused on their phones, their minds consumed by the fast-paced nature of their everyday lives. In the midst of the chaos, one figure stood out. An older man sitting quietly on the sidewalk with a weathered sign that read, "Need a dollar for food." God bless, his clothes were tattered, and his face was marked with the deep lines of hardship. The harsh afternoon sun cast long shadows on his frail form, but still, most people walked past without even glancing at him. As the crowd continued to move, Barron Trump and his friend walked down the sidewalk, engaged in a quiet conversation. Barron, though accustomed to the buzz of the city, had always been more reserved, more observant of his surroundings than his peers. But today, something felt different. His gaze caught the homeless man's, a momentary connection, a brief exchange of looks that was fleeting yet charged. For a moment, time seemed to slow down, the world around Barron fading away as his eyes met the man's tired gaze. The homeless man's face was a mix of exhaustion and hope. His eyes spoke of years of struggle, but there was still a glimmer of something else, a quiet plea for kindness, for human connection. Barron's steps faltered just for a second, as if the weight of the moment had grabbed him by the heart and wouldn't let go. His friend, oblivious to the tension building in Barron's chest, kept walking ahead, urging him to move faster. But Barron didn't budge. He stood still for a moment, his mind racing. Should he keep walking, as most people had done? Or should he stop, even if just for a second, and acknowledge this man's humanity? Barron's mind flickered with the lessons he had learned growing up, the world around him, the wealth, the power, the privilege. But in that moment, none of that mattered. He was just a young man, walking in a city filled with faces, some more recognizable than others, but each one a reflection of something bigger, something more. Barron's calm exterior betrayed none of the conflict that simmered beneath. He had been taught to avoid the discomfort of these situations, to keep walking, to avoid the questions, the responsibility. But the look in the homeless man's eyes, the raw vulnerability, something about it struck Barron deep within. A small voice inside him urged him to stop, to make a difference, even if it was just for one person. The tension in the air was thick, and for a moment, Barron hesitated. Should he reach into his pocket and give something? Would it even matter? Would it make a difference, or was it just a fleeting act of charity? The question swirled in his mind, but the moment was slipping away. With a deep breath, Barron made up his mind. He stepped closer to the man. Barron stood still, his feet planted firmly on the sidewalk, his eyes fixed on the homeless man in front of him. The world seemed to fade into the background, the noise of the bustling city, the hurried footsteps of pedestrians. All of it disappeared. All that mattered in that moment was the man sitting before him, his weathered sign asking for a simple dollar. Barron's heart thudded in his chest, a mixture of empathy and hesitation gripping him. The man's eyes, tired but filled with hope, locked onto his, and Barron felt the weight of their shared gaze. His friend, walking a few steps ahead, noticed Barron's sudden pause. "Come on, let's go," his friend called out, his voice casual, unaware of the internal battle Barron was waging. Giving them money doesn't help. It only keeps them stuck in their situation. Barron's friend, like so many others, had a clear opinion on the matter. He was used to seeing the homeless as part of the scenery, as people to avoid rather than to engage with. But Barron couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, this simple interaction, was different. He wasn't just walking past someone on the street. He was staring into the eyes of a person, someone with a story, with struggles, and with dignity. It was more than just a request for a dollar. It was a cry for help, a plea for someone to acknowledge that he existed. The hesitation in Barron's chest grew stronger as he thought about his upbringing, the lessons he had been taught about charity, about giving back. His mind raced, questioning what the right thing to do was. Should he just hand over the dollar and walk away, feeling like he'd done something? Or was there more to it? Was this man's story just a small part of a larger issue that deserved more attention than a mere transaction? Barron's fingers brushed the edge of his wallet, but the pull of his friend's words echoed in his mind. "It doesn't really help." What difference would $1 make in the grand scheme of things? The tension between doing something and doing nothing grew unbearable. Barron glanced around, seeing the indifferent faces of the people around him, everyone in their own world, rushing toward their destinations, avoiding the uncomfortable truth right in front of them. He thought back to his own life, the comfort he'd always had, the luxury of never having to worry about where his next meal was coming from. Barron had lived in a world of abundance, but here, in front of him, was a person who knew nothing but scarcity. The silence between them stretched on, and Barron felt the weight of his privilege pressed down on him. A sudden sense of clarity washed over him. This wasn't just about giving money. It was about acknowledging the humanity in front of him, about not turning a blind eye just because it was easier. With a deep breath, Barron made up his mind. He pulled out his wallet, opened it, and without a second thought took out a bill. He walked toward the homeless man, his steps slow but sure. The city around him faded as he knelt down in front of the man, his heart pounding with a mixture of anxiety and resolve. Barron handed the bill to the man, who looked up in surprise. The act seemed small, a simple gesture that many would overlook. But for Barron it felt monumental. In this brief moment he had taken action, made a choice. It wasn't just $1, it was his recognition of the man's humanity, his refusal to be indifferent. As Barron handed the bill to the homeless man, the world around them seemed to pause. For a brief moment, it was just the two of them. The noise of the city, the rush of passers-by, all faded into the background. The man's hands trembled as he took the money, and Barron couldn't help but notice the rawness in his movements. It wasn't just the shaky hands. It was the weight of a life lived in survival mode, one where even small gestures of kindness felt foreign. The homeless man's eyes lifted, meeting Barron's gaze with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. There was a depth in his eyes, a silent story of hardship, loss, and resilience. Barron's own breath caught in his throat as the man spoke, his voice hoarse but filled with a quiet power. "You didn't just give me money," the man said, his words slow but deliberate. "You gave me hope." Barron's chest tightened as the weight of those words hit him, deeper than anything he could have anticipated. He wasn't prepared for this moment. He hadn't expected the man to say anything at all, let alone something so profound. Barron stood there, frozen for a moment, unsure of how to respond. His hand, still extended in the motion of giving, hung in the air, and his heart raced as the gravity of the situation sank in. The homeless man didn't smile, but there was a flicker in his eyes, a kind of warmth that Barron hadn't expected to see. It wasn't just gratitude. It was something more. It was a recognition of Barron's humanity, his willingness to stop, to give, to acknowledge this person's existence. Barron felt a lump form in his throat as he realized that this simple act, which felt so small in the grand scheme of his life, had meant the world to the man in front of him. Barron swallowed hard, his thoughts spinning. He hadn't known what to expect when he had made the decision to give, but he certainly hadn't anticipated this kind of emotional reaction. The connection between them was brief, but undeniable. The homeless man, a stranger just moments before, had looked at Barron not with pity or resentment, but with something that felt like quiet gratitude, a recognition that the world hadn't entirely forgotten him. And in that moment, Barron didn't just see a man in need. He saw a human being, someone whose life, whose dignity, had been restored for just a brief moment. As Barron turned to walk away, he couldn't shake the man's words. "You gave me hope." The phrase echoed in his mind, reverberating in a way he hadn't expected. He had given the man $1, yes, but it was clear now that it was so much more than that. It wasn't the money that had mattered. It was the kindness, the acknowledgement that the homeless man wasn't invisible. Barron felt a deep sense of connection to someone outside of his usual circle, outside of the wealth and comfort he had known his whole life. For the first time, he realized how little things, simple acts of humanity, could make a difference in someone's life, even if it was just for a fleeting moment. As Barron walked away, the weight of the encounter lingered. He could no longer look at the world the same way. The homeless man had taught him something invaluable. That hope, however fragile, was the most powerful thing you could give to someone who had nothing left to hold on to. As Barron and his friend continued walking down the street, the noise of the city seemed to return to its usual rhythm. The hum of passing cars, the chatter of pedestrians, and the occasional clang of street vendors filled the air once again. Yet Barron's mind was elsewhere. The image of the homeless man's tired, grateful eyes, and the words, "You gave me hope," lingered in his thoughts, echoing in his mind. His friend, noticing the change in Barron's demeanor, glanced over at him with raised eyebrows. "You actually gave him money? I didn't think you'd stop for someone like that," he said, his tone a mix of surprise and curiosity. "I mean, you're Barron Trump. You've got the world at your feet. What's $1 going to do for him?" Barron didn't immediately answer. Instead, he paused, looking ahead but not truly seeing the street before him. He felt a strange stillness inside him, a feeling of clarity he hadn't experienced before. His friend's words had triggered something in him, a realization of just how different his world was from the one outside it. His friend, who had grown up in the same world of privilege, seemed unable to understand why Barron had made such a seemingly small gesture. "I don't know," Barron finally said, his voice quiet. "It wasn't just about the dollar. It was about seeing the person, you know?" His words felt like an attempt to articulate something that was still new to him, something that was hard to express. He looked over at his friend, who was still processing the interaction, and added, "I just couldn't keep walking by like everyone else. It didn't feel right." His friend let out a small laugh, clearly still not fully understanding. "You really think that guy's life is going to change from you giving him $1? He's probably just going to spend it on something else, you know?" Barron turned to face him, his eyes steady but filled with a quiet conviction. "Maybe," he said, "but I gave him a moment of dignity. Maybe he's used to being ignored, you know? Maybe for just a second, he didn't feel invisible." The words hung in the air, and Barron felt a slight shift within himself. His friend's skepticism didn't bother him. In fact, it made him realize something important: how easy it was to dismiss people when you were far removed from their struggles. But this moment, this small act of kindness, had broken through that indifference for Barron. He could no longer see the world through the same lens. A small action, something he'd once considered insignificant, had made him see beyond the surface, beyond the comfort of his own privilege. Barron walked in silence for a moment, reflecting on how little he had understood before today. He had lived in a bubble, untouched by the everyday struggles that most people faced. Giving the homeless man $1 wasn't about charity or validation. It was about recognizing the humanity in everyone, regardless of their circumstances. The impact, Barron realized, wasn't just on the man. It had changed something in him too. As they continued walking, Barron felt a sense of peace settle over him. The weight of his privilege, of his life, was still there, but now it came with a new understanding, a new awareness. The simple act of giving had ignited a shift in his perspective, and he knew it was something he would carry with him from this moment forward. Empathy, Barron understood now, was something that reached far beyond actions. It was a connection that could change everything, no matter how small the gesture. As Barron and his friend continued their walk, the air between them was thick with an unspoken tension. Barron's friend, who had initially dismissed the idea of stopping to help the homeless man, was now silent. His eyes kept flicking to Barron, as though something had shifted in him, and he wasn't sure how to respond. The earlier conversation, once casual and filled with indifference, now felt distant, as if it belonged to a different world. "Man, I don't know," his friend said after a long pause, his voice quiet. He had been thinking about Barron's action, and it clearly troubled him. "I thought you'd just give him $1 and keep moving. I didn't expect you to really stop and talk to him. Honestly, I didn't even think it'd make a difference. It just seemed so small, you know." He stopped walking for a moment, as if processing his thoughts aloud. "But I guess I was wrong." Barron looked at him, his face calm, but with a flicker of understanding. His friend was beginning to realize something Barron had felt too, though he hadn't known how to put it into words until now. Barron had acted with the belief that even the smallest act of kindness could have a profound impact, but he hadn't expected it to affect his friend in this way. Barron didn't want to come across as preachy, but something about the way his friend had spoken made him feel like this was the right moment to share. "You know," Barron began, his voice softer than usual, "I never really thought about it before, but it's easy to ignore things when you've never had to face them directly. We don't always realize how lucky we are, or how invisible other people feel. $1 might not change everything, but it's a way of saying, I see you. Barron looked at his friend, his expression earnest. Sometimes that's all it takes to make someone feel like they're not completely alone. His friend stood there for a moment, absorbing the weight of Barron's words. There was a long silence before he spoke again, his voice quieter, almost reflective. I guess I never thought about it like that. I've just always assumed that people on the streets, well, I don't know. It's like, you think they're just stuck in that situation, right? But, yeah, you're right. They're people too, and it's not like giving them money is going to fix their whole life. But it's a start, isn't it? Barron nodded, his heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and a sense of responsibility. He hadn't expected to change anyone's mind that day, but it was clear that his small act of kindness had sparked something in his friend. It wasn't just about helping the homeless man anymore. It was about the realization that privilege could blind people to the struggles of others, and that sometimes breaking that blindness required nothing more than a shift in perspective. As they continued their walk, Barron began to notice other people around him. A few passers-by gave him small, almost imperceptible looks, some confused, some curious, others with a faint smile, as if they, too, were somehow moved by the kindness they had witnessed. Barron felt the ripple of his action reach out, farther than he could have imagined. He realized as he walked on that kindness didn't always require grand gestures. Sometimes a simple moment of humanity could inspire others to reflect on their own behavior, and in turn, encourage them to be more mindful. It was then that Barron understood small acts of kindness, however fleeting, could lead to larger societal changes. Each person he encountered after that moment carried a little of that ripple with them, just as his friend had. And maybe, just maybe, that was how real change started, one small, intentional act at a time. Later that evening, Barron sat by the window of his room, gazing out at the lights of the city below. The noise of the world outside had quieted, but the weight of the day still lingered in his mind. He couldn't shake the words of the homeless man from his thoughts. You gave me hope. The phrase echoed over and over, reverberating inside his chest. Barron hadn't known it in the moment, but those words had unlocked something in him. He had always thought that power came from wealth, from influence, from the things he could acquire or achieve. But now, with the man's voice still fresh in his mind, Barron realized that the real power, the kind that changed lives, didn't come from anything external. It came from how you made people feel, how you connected with them, how you showed compassion. As Barron sat there, the weight of his own privilege pressed down on him. He thought about the life he had lived, a life full of comfort and ease, and how little he had paid attention to the struggles of others. He had never really seen, not until today, how small acts of kindness could create ripples that extended far beyond the person they were given to. The simple exchange with the homeless man had revealed something profound. Barron had the power to make a difference not by being born into a famous family, but by the choices he made each day. His actions, no matter how small, had the ability to influence people in ways he had never imagined. The more Barron reflected, the more he understood. He thought about his friend, how his views had shifted after the encounter. He thought about the other people who had witnessed his small act, and how it might have caused them to reflect on their own actions. Barron realized that, in that brief moment, he hadn't just handed over $1. He had reminded someone that they were seen, that they were valued, and that despite everything, hope still existed. And in turn, he had begun to see the world differently too. It was then that Barron made a silent vow to himself. He would continue to give, not for recognition, not for approval, but because he had learned that kindness, genuine kindness, was the most important thing he could give. It was a lesson that could never be forgotten, a lesson that transcended his name, his wealth, or his status. It was a lesson in humanity, in seeing the people around him, in acknowledging their struggles, and in offering something real, something meaningful in return. Barron knew he couldn't change the world overnight, but he could change his own small corner of it. As he sat there, watching the world go by outside his window, he felt a deep sense of hope. Hope for himself, for the world, and for the future. A future where his actions, however small, could create a ripple that might one day become a wave of change. He smiled softly, his heart a little lighter, knowing that he had learned the most valuable lesson of all. Kindness is the greatest form of wealth.